Cari fan di Inglorious Globastards, questo è un evento eccezionale perché abbiamo, come potete vedere sullo schermo, qui con noi il professor John Cochrane. Allora, per chi non si occupasse a tempo pieno di economia, voglio dire che John Cochrane è uno dei maggiori esperti di politica monetaria a livello mondiale. Io lo conosco ormai da quasi 40 anni perché è stato il mio professore di macroeconomia a Chicago. Proprio la prima lezione del primo corso del programma di PhD a Chicago me la fece John Cochrane. E quindi sono sempre rimasto molto affezionato sia professionalmente sia umanamente a lui e è un piacere enorme che abbia accettato di parlare con noi su questo canale del suo nuovo libro che si chiama The Fiscal Theory of the Price Level, che è secondo me una rivoluzione, se non copernicana, diciamo una bella rivoluzione nel modo di pensare fenomeni come inflazione, debito, politica fiscale, eccetera, eccetera, eccetera. Aggiungo che John ha un blog che si chiama The Grumpy Economist, che vi raccomando, e insieme a Niall Ferguson, che è uno dei massimi storici a livello mondiale, e un militare, ex militare, H.R. McMaster, ha questo podcast della Hoover Institution che vi raccomando di seguire, ha una cadenza più o meno settimanale o giù di lì, e tratta di temi veramente, veramente importanti in modo straordinario. Mi sembra di aver detto tutto. L'ultima cosa che mi fa piacere sottolineare è che John parla italiano molto bene perché ha vissuto a Firenze da ragazzo, è stato al liceo a Firenze in quanto il padre era un eminente storico del Rinascimento. Quindi faremo così, inizieremo un po' la conversazione in italiano, poi però per la parte un po' più tecnica passeremo all'inglese, perché l'italiano, diciamo così, non si presta molto per le spiegazioni di un certo livello. Allora, cominciamo con una frase famosa attribuita a Milton Friedman, cioè non attribuita, pronunciata da Milton Friedman. L'inflazione è sempre e ovunque un fenomeno monetario. Il libro di John non ribalta questa asserzione, però secondo me la estende perché in fondo la moneta è una liability, quindi è una passività del governo ed è un modo per acquisire risorse fiscali. Chi come me ha una certa dimestichezza con le teorie macroeconomiche conosce il famoso articolo di Sargent e Wallace sulla unpleasant monetary arithmetics, che spiega con dovizia di particolari come un governo si può finanziare o con le tasse o a debito o stampando moneta. Quindi moneta e debito sono parenti molto prossimi. Ma adesso lasciamo un po' la parola a John che ci spiega questo approccio che per me è innovativo ed è illuminante alla macroeconomia, in particolare a fenomeni come inflazione, deficit, debito, politica fiscale e tutto il resto. John, a te la parola.
Grazie tanto Fabio. Sì, hai ragione. Friedman è naturalmente un'enorme forza nell'economia e credo che lui e i monetaristi l'avevano 95% giusta, ma c'è ancora un 5%. Cioè siamo d'accordo, la teoria fiscale dei prezzi, il monetarismo, sono d'accordo che se il governo stampa, diciamo, 5 cosa un trillion in italiano, sono numeri più troppo grandi.
Trilione, in italiano è trilione.
Di soldi e li dà alla gente, ci sarà inflazione. Il monetarismo dice la stessa cosa che teoria fiscale dei prezzi. Il punto dove non siamo totalmente d'accordo, diciamo che il governo ci dà dei soldi, ma tiene in inverso, ci prende i buoni di tesoro, così non abbiamo più in totale, ma abbiamo troppo moneta e troppi pochi buoni di tesoro. Allora, questo ci fa andare a spendere o no. È una questione molto diversa. E lì la teoria fiscale dei prezzi dice, guardiamo, la moneta e i buoni di tesoro sono più o meno la stessa cosa. E se ti do uno di questi e ti tengo degli altri, sei più o meno allo stesso punto e questo non ti dà inflazione. Cioè, quello che conta è il totale della moneta data dal governo e i buoni di tesoro. Ora, la seconda questione è troppo riguardo a che? E quindi la teoria fiscale dei prezzi dice quello che ci dà inflazione è tutto il debito, incluso la moneta del governo, ma contro quanto ci aspettiamo che sul lungo tempo il governo potrà ripagare con le tasse, invece di MV equals PY, invece di una domanda per liquidità, per fare le nostre spese.
John, I think that at this point we can switch to English because now we enter in the delicate part of the explanation. So we want to be rigorous because it's very important. So,
but give me a B+ for trying.
No. It's wonderful how you explain it. It's really wonderful. But since this channel is also followed by academics and people who like to argue with us, we want to be extremely precise so that they don't we don't give them excuses to use spurious arguments against this theory. So let's go.
Fiscal theory. Inflation comes from total government debt relative to what we expect the government to be able to repay over the long run with primary surpluses. That doesn't mean today's deficits cause inflation. A government can borrow a tremendous amount if we all expect that it will repay it later. That does not cause inflation. It's not as easy as debt causes inflation, not as easy as deficits cause inflation. Good thing, because those don't. But it's this delicate balance of overall government debt relative to long-term ability to repay that fundamentally causes inflation. Why is this important? Monetarism is a beautiful theory, but our central banks do not control the money supply. They set interest rates. So monetarism might well work for 1960, but it does not work today because governments set interest rates. It simply doesn't apply to today's economy. And here's a theory that does. Okay, I'll let you go.
No, in order to give an example that helps understand what you mean in practice, I'd like you to describe what happened in the Reagan era and the Volcker disinflation. So the common knowledge, let's say the common story, is that thanks to Volcker's very tight monetary policy, the inflation of the 70s was finally conquered. Your story is different. And it's a fiscal story, not a monetary policy story. Can you explain that to us?
Well, it's both. Now, you had to bring up the hardest question first, because I'm ready for what happened 2 years ago. Our government shoveled $5 trillion out the window. We got inflation. Duh, that one was easy. Then you got to go ask me the hard question. What about?
We'll get there. Yes, absolutely. But let's explain through that episode, which is well known, well analyzed, how your view differs from the let's say commonly held view.
Yeah, so in fiscal theory of the price level, there is still lots of room for central banks to be powerful. Central banks, by raising interest rates, can lower inflation, though only temporarily. So they can really help. And we see over and over again, especially in Latin America, central banks tighten, inflation goes down for a while, but then fiscal policy doesn't get fixed and inflation comes right back again. So as I understand 1980, now this isn't yet scholarly. I think a real history, a fiscal history of the 1980s needs to be done. But as I look at it, there is a tantalizingly good story. Where did inflation come from in the 1970s? Well, we all kind of know Johnson, Bretton Woods, Vietnam War, Great Society, deficit spending. That's kind of the standard story of how inflation broke out. The decline in productivity of the 70s, the government wasn't bringing in as much money as we thought because GDP was lower. So there's a fiscal story there. 1980, yes, the sharp thing that happened in 80 to 82 was a monetary contraction, but it was quickly accompanied by and followed by important fiscal reforms. So also in the 1980s, they reformed Social Security so that the long-run debt problem that the US was facing is suddenly fixed. They had a series of tax reforms that lowered the top marginal rate from 70% to 28%. It's a big one.
Yeah.
And together with a big deregulation, the economy just started booming. And remember, where the government gets tax revenue is not from higher tax rates. Tax revenue is tax rate times income. So the best way to get revenue is let income grow. That's exactly what happened in the US. So fiscal reform, deregulation, growing economy, by the late 80s, early 90s, money is flowing into the government. This was a classic joint fiscal monetary stabilization of the kind that typically Latin America does not do. They just do the monetary part and then the fiscal thing isn't there. And as the kind, and in a way, the most classic one is the ends of the hyperinflations after World War I, where the government solved the fiscal problem and inflation stopped on a dime. So you have to do joint fiscal and monetary, and the fiscal part was there in the 1980s, which is, I think the way to tell the story is that's why it stuck. Lots of people thought in 1982, 83, I'm old enough to have been there, that inflation's coming right back. That here comes Brazil. This is a temporary pause, just like 1973 was a temporary pause, 1977 was a temporary pause. This is a temporary pause, inflation's coming right back again. The question isn't why did inflation come down? The question is why didn't it come back again? And I think the answer is a big suite of fiscal and microeconomic reforms. All the good stabilizations have monetary, fiscal, microeconomic reform so that we see a new regime. The inflation targets are a similar example. They all come with fiscal and microeconomic reforms as well. So that's as good as I'm going to get you for the 1980s for now.
No, but this is also relevant for the euro and the Maastricht Treaty. When the monetary union was conceived, wasn't conceived only as a monetary shift. It was also conceived as a fiscal rule, which was enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty and in the famous 3% deficit to GDP ratio and 60% debt to GDP ratio, which were not too, let's say, they weren't enforced harshly, but at least they gave a sort of long-term range in terms of expansion of government liabilities and fiscal policy. But in order to make, to explain this concept from a slightly different point of view, I very much like your explanation, your interpretation of money as stocks in government activities. Can you explain exactly how this can be conceived? How this relationship between stocks into a company are analogous to money for the government?
Money and government debt. So first
government
of all,
debt, yes.
Government debt is just a promise to give you more money in the future. So it's all pretty much the same thing. And these days, money is mostly not cash. It's mostly interest-paying overnight reserves at the central bank, which the central bank's just a big money market fund. It holds government debt. So it's just overnight government debt. We just have lots of government debt. Yes, so if you have government debt, I learn a very few things, and like a 2-year-old with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mm-hmm. And one thing I learned a long time ago is price equals present value of dividends. So fiscal theory is basically an application of that basic idea to the government. What is the value of government debt? Well, it is the expected discounted present value of the surpluses, taxes greater than spending, that the government will use to retire that debt. And now our debt promises dollars, your debt promises euros. So it's nominal government debt. So suppose we wake up one morning and decide, these guys are not going to pay this off. What are we going to do about that? Well, we recognize that the value of our debt is more than the value of the present value of the surpluses that repay it. We try to get rid of it. How do we get rid of it? Try to buy stuff. That sends up the price of goods and services. So exactly the same way, if you wake up and you own a stock and you say, this company's never going to make money, you try to sell it, what happens? The stock price goes down. The number of shares doesn't change. The stock price has to go down. Well, the same thing. The amount of debt can't change unless you default. So what has to happen is the price level has to go up, so the real value of that debt falls. So the mechanics are exactly like the mechanics by which price equals present value. That's lovely for those of us who learned one simple theory. That's hard. The same way the stock market's hard. Economists can never tell you whether stocks are too high or too low or where they're going to go tomorrow. The theory says it's going to be very hard, and unfortunately, then that says that explains why it's so hard to forecast inflation, because it's about as easy as forecasting stock prices.
This calls into question the revision of the Stability Pact in Europe, because I don't know if you're following the debate, but they have ventilated the idea of switching from numerical, harsh, definite targets to a sustainability concept. But sustainability is a matter of trust, and trust cannot be measured. So, as you said, one day somebody wakes up and says, the government is not going to repay the debt. The revision of the Stability Pact wants to avoid this problem, this lack of trust, this sudden or maybe less sudden lack of trust. What would be a way to ensure, from the policy point of view, that sustainability is credible?
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger exactly on the central question as far as a fiscal theorist looks at it. Fundamentally, what gives us low inflation is that people have faith that the government can and will, one way or another, pay off its debts. And if we think they're going to inflate them away tomorrow, then we try to get rid of our money, and the inflation happens today. So you need it's not about Joe and Jane or Alberto and Antonella don't sit around the kitchen table and say, here's what I think the deficit will be in the year 2045. No, that's not how it works. They have a general faith that their governments are sober and one way or another will pay off this debts, and that's, that they are sustainable. Now, the euro is also a fiscal theory thing, and I'll advertise my next paper. I'm working now with two very talented co-authors, Luis Garicano and Klaus Masuch, on analyzing the euro's current problems. Because, of course, the problem for the European Central Bank is that there are, I think now 21 different agencies that can issue government debt. And if the way it's going to work is that can never default and we'll just print money to pay it off, you have a real problem. It's bad enough when there's one government that can issue government debt and count on the central bank to always print up money to pay it off. When there's 21, each one has an incentive to issue too much debt and then say, oh, crisis, come bail me out. And bad things will happen. So from the get-go, the people who set up the Maastricht Treaty, the European architecture, understood this. And that was the idea. Well, they tried to say, look, they pre-commit. Look, the central bank is not going to print up money to pay off your debts. But we'll make sure you don't run up too much debts anyway, because we're not so sure. There's a little tension there, right? If you knew the central bank will never monetize debts, and if you borrow too much, you will default, just like a company. Exactly. Then you wouldn't care. Go ahead, borrow as much as you want, because we're not going to pay it off. Well, we're not so sure. So you better not run up too much debt. Promptly, France and Germany blew right through the debt limits. So here we go. And we've been around the circle forever. Mario Draghi said, whatever it takes, which is a promise to print up money to pay off debt, but put in some conditionality, be good boys, be good boys and girls, don't borrow too much. And now we're in a third round of exactly the same problem. The size of debts is still very large. They're sustainable so long as interest rates stay low, but interest rates can't stay low forever. And so now what is the poor ECB to do? And we have to put that cat back in the bag, so to say. If every country were to run very sober, responsible, sustainable fiscal policies, that would help. But of course, each one has an incentive not to. It's a tough answer, a tough question. I would favor a system where we really understand sovereigns are like companies, and if they can't repay, they default. So part of what we've done, and part of what Europe has done, is made it artificially difficult. Italian government debt is stuffed into Italian banks. So if the Italian government defaults, the Italian banking system goes under. There's a hostage right there to an Italian government default. Well, what's going on with that? So one option is make sovereign default thinkable. The other option is we're going to really be serious about making debt sustainable. It's hard to tell what's sustainable today wasn't sustainable tomorrow. Greece was sustainable in 2006. It had very low interest rates. Yeah, it had a lot of debt, but the interest costs were low. Then all of a sudden, interest costs went up, and it wasn't sustainable anymore. So pronouncing what's sustainable or not from on high is going to be difficult. And small amounts of debt. Argentina has debt crises with 40% debt to GDP, because people say, well, that's not even sustainable. So the idea of obeying deficit rules and debt rules, we've tried that over and over again. I wouldn't put enormous faith in that.
But I can give you an example which I witnessed directly: Lebanon. I mean, 6 months before the economy collapsed because government debt was hugely unsustainable. But it had been unsustainable for decades. Like 170% of GDP, whatever GDP might mean, because they didn't have a real measure of GDP. But anyway, this was the order of magnitude. And it had been like that for literally decades. And so everybody was nonchalant. Oh, yeah, well, everything is going to be fine. We've been in this situation forever. It will continue forever. Until it doesn't. And then now, 80% of the population lives below the poverty line. But Alberto, I want to bring you in if you have any questions.
Let me quickly just jump in on that issue, because I did, the idea of money as stock is a nice parable, but it really should be money as a bank. Money as short-term debt. Our governments typically finance themselves by rolling over very short-term debt. So the The mechanism to think about with inflation is very much like a run. And the same with debt sustainability. By rolling over short-term debt, that means it can go on and on and on, and it can be unsustainable. The US, our Congressional Budget Office, has said this is unsustainable for 30 years now. Because as long as the interest rates are low, actually present values might be the wrong way to think about it. As long as the interest rates are low, as long as we can make the payments, everything's fine. But you're sitting on this earthquake fault that maybe it won't, and the mechanics are unpredictable. It's like a bank run. When people get worried, then interest rates go up, and then it's not sustainable. That's the danger, not something apparently foreseeable. Like banks. Silicon Valley Bank was passing all of its regulatory requirements the day before it failed. Lehman Brothers was passing all its capital requirements the day before it failed. And we got to be worried that that's the same way government did. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to get that little piece in there. Alberto.
No, I'm trying to catch up. It's very difficult. I'm not an economist. But John, compared to the classic monetarist policy, how much does your fiscal monetary, where does your fiscal monetary policy differ? I missed it. You explained it, I missed it, sorry. I will ask you to do it again.
That's because I tried to explain it in Italian and probably didn't do a very good job.
No, your Italian is wonderful. Just I didn't get it. You can try in Italian. I don't think it's your language.
I'll try in English this time. So first of all, classic monetarism. First of all, that really is out of our central banks set interest rates. So contemporary macroeconomics is not about controlling the money supply. It's about controlling interest rates. And because it just doesn't apply. But in theory, how does it work? So monetarism says the government gives you, let's say, $5 trillion of money. You go out and spend it, you get inflation. Well, fiscal theory agrees with that. If I give you $5 trillion of money, you're going to go out and spend it, and that causes inflation because that's a fiscal transfer. It's a gift. If I give you $5 trillion, but here's how we do it.
Can I just make a little remark here? You get inflation because that money is spent, but there isn't enough supply to satisfy that additional demand. So that's the mechanism.
If there's inadequate demand, first we expand output, and then once we hit the output limit, then we get inflation. Yeah, that's why I said $5 trillion. $10, maybe we just get more output. Nominal GDP goes up, and price versus output depends. Now, so that one we agree on. But what if the government gives you $5 trillion of money and takes back $5 trillion of treasury bills? So now you are no wealthier. There's no wealth effect at all. There's just a portfolio composition effect, right? You have 5 trillion more money, but you have 5 trillion less treasury bills. It's not so obvious you're going to run out and spend it so quickly. So that's the key conceptual question, whether it's the quantity of money, the composition of government debt being too much short-term and not enough long-term, or whether it's the overall quantity of government debt. And the second difference is really, is it relative to what? So the monetarism is the quantity of money relative to sort of the inventory you need to make transactions, whereas fiscal theory would say the total quantity of government debt relative to your ability to pay it back. And deeply, is the story of the value of money a backing story? The money is valuable because it is a claim to something real. In the old days, it used to be a claim to a bar of gold. Now it's a claim to future taxes. Or is it valuable because it's an inherently worthless thing that we just need to keep some of around to make our transactions? So that's a fundamental difference.
Thank you.
You're looking just as confused as you were before, so I don't think I'm doing a very good job.
Yeah, little by little.
No, but in this sense, John, there is an observation I want to make. Debt to GDP, the ratio of debt to GDP, is the most closely watched indicator of fiscal sustainability. But it's very different if you have 100% debt to GDP ratio in a country where, let's say, the tax is 20% of GDP, and in a country where the tax is 40 or maybe 50% of GDP. Because in the first one, you can increase taxes by a hefty amount and be able to repay the debt because you don't create too much damage to the economy. In a country already heavily taxed, what happens when you try to increase taxes to pay off the debt?
Yeah, well, you left out spending. The other, you don't have to just raise taxes, you can cut spending too.
Yeah.
But, right.
No, but you see, cut spending, it's in Europe, it's like unheard of, anathema, with one exception, major exception in France, where Macron has managed with incredible difficulties to lower the retirement age from, to increase the retirement age from 62 to 64. And this has, this has created a revolt all over France with millions of people in the streets and often, violent clashes with police. And I would say that in order to bring inflation down to the 2% target, Macron has done more than the ECB, according to your theory, right?
Well, France spends 55% of GDP as government spending.
Exactly.
Bringing that down, bringing that down to 52 doesn't sound to me like austerity.
No, not at all. But you see what kind of political reaction you trigger for a very limited reform of the major entitlement program in France.
So there's tax, right? Surplus, what repays debt is taxes over spending. So it helps if your tax base is small or if your spending is also small, if you have fiscal space. And yes, there is a Laffer curve. I don't know where we are on it, but if you raise tax rates, that marginal tax rates, that lowers how much people work, save, invest, start companies, and you get less income. It's like walking up a sand dune. You take a step forward, but you slip a step back. And if the sand dune's really slippery, it can go the other way. So there's, once, in Europe, roughly your 50% of GDP government spending. That means the average tax rate somewhere, sometime, somehow is 50%. And for anybody who isn't paying 50% tax, there's somebody who's paying more than 50% tax. Now, at some point, I don't know where that Laffer curve is, but 50, 60, 70% tax rates, people don't work so hard. My marginal tax rate's about 70%. I live in California. And, if somebody says, come give a talk, and I'll pay you $1,000, I say, I might take home 300 of that, not worth getting on the plane. That calculation does come in. And that's really Europe's huge problem right now is growth. Italy's tragedy is that since 2010, GDP per capita is going the wrong way. This is, I do inflation. We sort of look where we know answers, but inflation isn't the big question. The big question is why in the US growth slowed down by half in 2000. And in Europe, it has come it's slowed down even more. In Italy, it's come to a standstill. I was sad to see Italy just decided that you're not going to participate in the next technological revolutions by banning ChatGPT.
Don't get me started on that because I'll go off a tangent.
And banning the use of the English language. By the way, we're probably going to get censored here because we're doing.
Oh yeah, no, you will get a fine of a few $1 million for having dared to speak in English on an Italian YouTube channel.
I'll pay it back in lira, so because I still have about 1 million, at least a few thousand lira sitting in the couch drawer. Raising marginal tax rates is just gonna, you got to be pretty close to the point where raising marginal tax rates just lowers growth to the point it's useless, or raises tax evasion at least to the point where you're not getting. I mean, Europe, at the high ends, you're getting a 50% income tax. 40% payroll tax, 20% VAT. I don't know how you guys live. What do you get? €5 to go home and buy an ice cream. And the ice cream's pretty darn good, but you want some more things when you come home. So yeah, debt to GDP is a terrible number because it's about debt to GDP relative to the government's ability to raise revenue, especially in bad times. And very large debt to GDP is possible. The US exited World War II with well over 100% debt to GDP and mostly paid it off. We inflated away a good deal of it, but we paid a lot of it off. Well, we had the ability to raise taxes. The most famous case, the UK after the Napoleonic Wars had like 140% debt to GDP, and it was under the gold standard. And they went back to gold at parity and paid the whole darn thing off. Now they had the Industrial Revolution, it helped a lot, but it is possible to pay off large debts to GDP, and it's possible to have debt crises with very low debt to GDP, as you said, if you don't have the taxing capacity. And just one more, where I really worry for our governments, all of these projections are if nothing bad happens. Even this Congressional Budget Office that said the U.S. is unsustainable, all those scenarios look a lot, they didn't say financial crisis and pandemic. They said, here's how bad it is if nothing bad happens. Well, what if China invades Taiwan? What if there's another pandemic that this time looks a little more like the plague and a lot less like a flu? Then our governments need to borrow enormous amounts of money. So that fiscal capacity to meet a shock by borrowing a lot more and pledging, not just inflating away debt, but pledging future taxes. When the current tax rate, average tax rate is 50%, government spending is 50%, where's your fiscal space to meet a shock? You're getting me worried.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Alberto, I don't know if you want to make a remark on this point.
Alberto's looking more and more.
By the way, Alberto has written an article in 2018, so on the next pandemic, saying, one day we'll get one.
We will.
Yeah, and so he predicted correctly that, for a number of reasons here, we don't want to, elaborate on that, but he was sounding the alarm like a couple of years before it happened.
Good for you.
Do you think, John, that the U.S. does not have taxing capacity?
Yeah, I think the U.S. has tremendous taxing capacity because we have, we too, remember about the U.S. numbers, we have federal, state, and local. You guys do most of the stuff at a federal level. So our federal tax rates look low to you. The top marginal tax rate's only 40%, 42%. But states also charge. So in California, I pay 42%, well, the people richer than me pay 42% federal and then 13.5% state. And then they pay sales taxes on top of that. So there's a lot of taxes in the US. But our overall government spending is in the 42-ish range percent of GDP. That's still a lot. I mean, the average tax rate's 42 somewhere, somehow. But I do look at, we have a chaotic income tax system. Look only at the hilarious joke of President Trump's tax returns recently made public, and then they disappeared from the news because it didn't fit anybody's political narrative that he was just using every loophole, Swiss cheese deduction, credit, whatever, that our government hands out to real estate developers, all perfectly legal. And that was such an embarrassment, I think, to the Democrats that boom, quickly, we don't see anything. But we have this tax system with very high statutory marginal rates, but all sorts of deductions, exclusions, and credits. So we don't raise that much money. The federal government raises about 20% of GDP in tax revenue. And no matter what the tax rate is, tax rate 70%, we raise 20% of GDP. Tax rate's 22%, we raise 20% of GDP. It doesn't really matter what the tax rate is because it's all in the deductions and stuff. So if the US were to adopt a value-added tax, get rid of the stupid income tax, and adopt a even consumption tax, a progressive consumption tax, a value-added tax, we could raise a huge amount more money than we do at much lower marginal rates, grow like crazy, and free up an entire generation of lawyers and accountants to productive work and help the supply side economy. So just looking at the chaos of our tax system makes me think that there's a much more efficient one out there that could raise revenue. Now that's, politically, where does that go? Good question.
Alberto, you were saying something. You were asking.
Questions. We don't, I think, have it by raising rates with the current tax code. We
John, very attentively.
Alberto, I think you were speaking at the same time, so we didn't get.
I'm following John. I'm fine. I'm enjoying John a lot.
John, the last question I would like to ask you is regards the post-Lehman Great Depression, because here a lot of Keynesian would say, you see, we have printed trillions of money. The government debt has skyrocketed. Yet we haven't seen any inflation. And there were people like Alan Meltzer, another eminent monetary economist, who in 2014 was predicting inflation out of control in a few months, or at least in a couple of years. That inflation did not materialize between, let's say, 2009 and 2021, despite this huge increase in the balance sheet of central banks. How does your fiscal theory of price level explain this phenomenon, which, from the point of view of monetarists, Milton Friedman's monetarist perspective, cannot be explained?
So thank you. I regard, of course, the answer is going to be, I regard the 2010s as a huge victory for the fiscal theory of the price level.
Yeah. So we want to see why.
You knew that answer was coming.
That's a little bit of marketing is understandable. Jokes apart.
Now, how?
How did that happen?
So in 2008, the economy collapsed. We started to see deflation. Interest rates were stuck at zero. And the whole Keynesian consensus says, here comes the deflation spiral. So interest rates are stuck at zero. You're seeing deflation. Prices are going down. So the real interest rate is now positive. That lowers aggregate demand. That lowers inflation anymore. More deflation. Higher real interest rates still. Unstable spiral. Here goes 1933 again. That was a clear prediction. It is a correct prediction of the Keynesian models, loudly made throughout the early 2010s. Here comes the great deflation spiral. It never happened. Now, fiscal theory is completely happy with that, because that's not the mechanism in fiscal theory. And in fact, very crucially, it's not the mechanism. Here's what fiscal theory says happens. The deflation breaks out, and a fiscal theory says, well, wait a minute. If we're going to, suppose we have a big deflation, 50% cut in the price level, that doubles the value of government bonds. So the government, if it's going to pay off its bonds, has to run immense austerity. They have to double taxes to pay off this windfall. All the Wall Street fat cats and the Chinese central bankers get paid back in dollars worth twice what they were before. Now, what government on this planet do you think would run into a big deflation, and their answer would be, we need to raise taxes to pay this windfall to bondholders? Heck no, we're doing stimulus, exactly what they did. Yeah. And the fiscal theory says, now if nobody expects the government to raise taxes, then the price level can't fall. So bingo, no deflation spiral, victory for fiscal theory. We go on into the 2010. Now then the monetarists came along. And there was this huge QE where they took in treasury bills. Now remember, QE was not we print money and we give it to you. We did that in 2020. QE was we take in treasury bills and we give you back overnight treasury bills. We give you back a money market fund that holds treasury bills. Fiscal theory says, who cares? I took your $5, I took your $20 bills and I give you 2 5s and a 10. Big deal. That's an open change operation. The monetarists said quite clearly, here comes the hyperinflation. I mean, really, reserves went from $10 billion to $3,000 billion, and the same thing in Europe. So they're correct, and this was back to your original question, and when Alberto asked it again, how is monetarism different from fiscal theory? Monetarism says if you take in $3 trillion worth of bonds and give out $3 trillion worth of overnight reserves, Zimbabwe didn't happen. So check two. Quantitative easing, we argue about that it changed interest rates 20 basis points or whatever. But this was an atom bomb. You raise money by 3,000%. That should have sent an immense explosion. And if you're arguing about 2 basis points, nothing happened. So victory number two, I would put it for fiscal theory, the price level. And then, of course, came 2020, where they did, late 2010s, the Keynesians kept saying, what we need to do is more fiscal stimulus. And don't worry about supply. Supply is always out there. You need to borrow lots and lots of money, print lots of money, give it to people. That's all you need to do, and the economy will really grow like crazy. Well, 2020 was a great lesson because they did exactly what the modern monetarists and the Keynesians and the secular stagnationists had been asking for. Guess what? There's supply, here's demand. Boom, we were right there. And we were very close, and it got inflation. It didn't. So wonderful news about inflation. Secular stagnation, lack of demand, that's over. You want to grow your economies now? The time-tested method of throw money out the windows is gone. We want economic growth. It's got to come from the supply side. That's the big lesson of the 2020s. Now, the slightly embarrassing thing, wait a minute, why did the big deficits of the 2020s cause inflation? But the not so big, but still big deficits, 2008, why didn't those cause inflation? And at least there's a plausible answer, 2 plausible answers of 5. I'll give you 2. One, it was much smaller. 2008 was about $1 trillion. 2020 was about $5 trillion, similar numbers in Europe. The other, and much less, in 2008, there was a plausibly lack of aggregate demand. There was a financial crisis, whereas much less of that in 2020. The other was, reason 2, our leaders in 2008 had the decency to say it's temporary. And we're going to deficit today, but deficit reduction in the future. So it's about today's deficits relative to, does it get repaid? Now, we all, I make fun of politicians' promises, and I did make fun of the politicians' promises in 2008, but at least they had the decency to promise we're borrowing money, we're spending it, and we will pay it back, so don't worry. Whereas in 2020, they didn't even have the decency to make that promise. What all of the US politicians said was, don't worry about it. That doesn't matter anymore. That's old-fashioned stuff. Modern monetary theory, R less than G, whatever you want. In fact, Congress in the US even passed budget resolutions don't count anymore. So every other spending in the US, you're supposed to at least pretend the more spending where's the taxes to pay for it. They passed laws saying, no, we're spending this stuff and you don't have to even talk about taxes to pay for it. So on the concept of deficit relative to expected repayment, there's a good story that 2020, the expected repayment wasn't there in the way that it might well have been in 2008. And last, we got really lucky. So after 2008, interest costs on the debt went down to zero, went to negative. In Europe and in the US, people were paying our governments to take their money because the interest rate was zero, inflation was 1% to 2%. So the government's got negative interest costs on the debt for a decade. And then that was a present. Now that's not going to happen again. We're certainly not, interest costs on the debt aren't going to go down 5 percentage points for a decade to help us pay this stuff off. And so that's another big difference of the current situation versus the early 2000s. And I would focus interest costs on the debt. There's the price and present value way of looking at things, and there's the flow way of looking at things. And I think for most people thinking in terms of flows, interest costs on the debt is one of the useful ways of understanding it. And in the 2010s, the interest costs on the debt were low. And we're like a family in 2006 that took out a huge adjustable rate mortgage. Hey, honey, we can afford the payments, don't worry. Well, you can't always afford the payments, and now we're facing that.
So if I look at the future, the quantitative tightening, this sharp tightening of monetary policy through the raise in interest rate, is it going to be that effective to bring down the inflation rate to 2% or that kind of target? And if not, or if I have to draw an implication from your theory, this would not be sufficient unless you find a way to boost growth, so to increase productivity, to make a jump on the innovation frontier. Otherwise, all these efforts, all these, I call it austerity for lack of better alternative, is not going to work, or at least is not going to be effective. And at some point, inflation will come back, maybe not as viciously as in Latin America in the 80s, but will go into a cycle which resembles those years, those decades.
That's possible. I mean, it's hard to forecast, especially the future.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
but the two pillars, like the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, cannot be separated in your view. So monetary policy alone won't do the trick. And to be even more blunt, monetary policy is a bit of a sideshow compared to the impact that growth and innovation and increasing productivity can have in the in the mix of macroeconomic policies.
So let me
am I right, or am I saying something?
No, this is, I'm going to give you the usual economist on the one hand, on the other hand.
Yeah, okay.
So the optimistic view is that, from the fiscal theory point of view, is that the big blowouts, the big fiscal blowouts of the 2020s were one-time events. We raised the stock of debt 20% with no real plan to pay it off. That means the price level has to go up 20%, inflate away that debt, and then the inflation goes away. So even if the central banks do nothing. So there is a transitory argument, right? Because you're just inflating away that one-time spending has a one-time rise in the price level, but not a permanent raise in the rate of inflation. On the other hand, fiscal policy doesn't look so good right now. So we are, if we get continuing inflation, it's really because of the continuing fiscal problems, and people have now woken up. Hey, the US is running $1 trillion deficit with 3.6% unemployment. There is just no excuse for running huge deficits when you're at and beyond, potential GDP, and Europe is doing much the same. So the question for inflation is ongoing fiscal stress, and then probably not going to do much one way or the other until the next crisis comes, which will come sooner than we think. And yeah, the monetary policy can slow things down, but it's sort of like you're in a car and the driver's got the gas pedal down and you can pull on the parking brake, but that's limited. So the monetary policy has an effect, but it's much more limited, sort of this fiscal monetary view. It's much more limited than most people think. Milton Friedman won too much. In the 1960s, people thought central banks were irrelevant, and inflation is just wage price spirals and negotiations and so forth. Then Friedman said, no, central banks are important. And now people think central banks just nail the price level and completely powerful. No, they can affect it, but they're not. They're the parking brake. So there's two things you mentioned. Quantitative tightening, as a fiscal theory guy, I think QE didn't do much on the way up, so I don't think QT does much on the way down. Whether you hold treasury debt directly or hold it through some giant mutual fund called the central bank, who cares? Now, this is all of the financial markets explode and they think quantitative easing is like gas on the fire. I just can't see any reason for it. So that doesn't make any, it can't help going down. It didn't cause inflation going up, and it's not going to cure it coming back down. Interest rates, by raising interest rates, central banks can, it appears, induce a bit of a recession. That's a feature, not a bug, and therefore temporarily lower inflation. But if there's an ongoing fiscal fire, that's a temporary effect. And usually fiscal and monetary policy work together to fight inflation. If we have monetary policy fighting fiscal policy, it's going to be even less effective. Yeah. So our inflation comes from too much fiscal policy. There's no question. The ECB and the Fed did not lower interest rates to cause this inflation. They were sitting there at zero and they were asleep. Fine. But they didn't cause the inflation came from fiscal policy, and ongoing inflation has got to be ongoing fiscal rather than monetary policy. So what happens if a central bank raises interest rates? Well, 100% debt to GDP ratios, 160 in Italy, your interest costs on the debt go up. Every 1% of interest rate is a 1% of GDP more interest cost on the debt, 1% of GDP more deficit, unless you tighten fiscal policy by 1%. Now, that's not happening. So monetary tightening is a fiscal loosening. It's going to cause each 1% interest rate is 1% more kind of permanent deficit. Furthermore, suppose central banks raise interest rates and this causes a recession, which is the point. Well, you're going to get more unemployment payments. You're going to get less tax revenue. You're going to get stimulus. You're going to get bailouts. And now we add, since central banks scandalously did not ask anyone to put their seatbelts on before takeoff, raising interest rates is going to make all the too big to fail banks insolvent. And now we have to pile some fiscal bailout to the central banks. So normally monetary policy, when it raises interest rates, fiscal policy helps by paying the higher interest costs on the debt, by paying the anti-recession stimulus and so forth. But now monetary policy is going to cause bad fiscal reactions. And so monetary policy acting alone is much less powerful than monetary policy with fiscal help. So I do think central banks' ability to control inflation in our current fiscal environment is very limited. And the outcome is fiscal sobriety. In the US, we spend money like it's like nobody ever has to repay it. So, at least spend money wisely, please, dear politicians, along with, microeconomic growth. That's the way you reprogram the simulation. You have a hard, it's either inflation or high taxes. And how do you program your way out of this one? Grow.
Yeah. No, but we have the same problem in Italy in terms of quality of spending. We have an egregious example, which was uncovered a week ago. About this next generation EU, this huge program by the European Union, which is supposed to essentially induce reforms, increase the potential output, make the economy more productive, and blah, blah, blah. In Italy, they finance the new stadium in Florence and in Venice. So that's the, growth and productivity enhancing expenses.
As a perpetual fan of the Fiorentina, I cannot object to a better stadium.
No, but Venice has a team which is in B series and is on the verge of bankruptcy. So I don't even think that stadium will be ever used for big sport events. But
in the US, we have we actually are way better than Europe at throwing money down rat holes. Subways in the US cost $4 billion per mile to construct. High-speed train in California, they haven't laid a single line of track already. The cost estimates are $100 billion to go from Fresno to Bakersfield. And at costs 5 times what libertarian free market France pays to construct high-speed rail. So you got nothing on us as far as throwing money down rat. And this is part of it. There is this mentality that came from the 2010s of secular stagnation. Government, they pay us 1% a year to take their money. So government debt is free. You can borrow government debt and throw it out the window and it doesn't matter. That mentality has to end because we're all facing it. We're at the supply constraint. And you know, if a government says we're going to borrow a ton of money and create jobs, well, those create jobs have to come from somebody else, because everybody who wants to work is already working. And you got to spend money like, you know, you have to repay it. You do. And that mentality has not quite gotten yet into either Brussels or Washington.
John, thanks a lot. You've been very kind with your time. We have enjoyed enormously your explanations. And I hope that in the future you'll be so kind to accept our invitation for further discussion on macroeconomic themes. And Alberto and I are extremely grateful for this appearance on our channel. I switch to Italian. Cari fan, mi raccomando, iscrivetevi al canale. Un piccolo sforzo per mettere un like e se commentate io vi risponderò. Se non sarò in grado di rispondere sarà John, o meglio chiederò a John qual è la risposta giusta. Grazie a tutti, un saluto e un abbraccio.
Ciao John, thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Un piacere.